When Nia Thompson, a waitress working the night shift, stumbles upon an old leather wallet, she has no idea she's about to unlock a buried truth, one that powerful forces tried to erase. But the more she digs, the clearer it becomes. Some secrets refuse to stay buried. What she uncovers next? It will change everything. Stay with me, because this story isn't just shocking, it's real. Before we dive into this unbelievable discovery, take a second to comment below where you're watching from today. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that stay with you long after they're told. The neon sign outside Manny's Diner flickered against the dark Atlanta sky. The place had been around for decades, a staple for truckers, night shift workers, and locals looking for a late-night meal. Inside, the atmosphere was warm but quiet, the hum of an old jukebox playing soft blues in the background. It was closing time, and most of the tables had been cleared, save for a few lingering coffee cups and crumpled napkins. Nia Thompson, a 27-year-old black waitress, moved swiftly through the diner, wiping down counters and flipping chairs onto tables. She was exhausted but used to the routine. She had dreams bigger than this diner, dreams of becoming a journalist, but reality had a way of forcing people to pause their ambitions, and for Nia, that meant taking night shifts at Manny's to save money for college. She glanced at the clock, almost midnight. Just one more wipe down, then she could call it a night. As she moved toward the last booth by the window, her sneaker caught against something uneven. She frowned, crouching down to check. A loose floorboard stuck up just slightly under the booth. Nia glanced around. The diner was empty now, except for Victor, the cook, who was finishing up in the kitchen. Curiosity tugged at her. She pressed her fingers against the board and wiggled it. It gave way easily, lifting up just enough to reveal something wedged inside, a dust-covered leather wallet. Her heart pounded as she carefully pulled it free, brushing away the thick layer of grime. It looked old, really old. The leather was cracked, the edges worn from time. It must have been stuck under the floor for years. She turned it over in her hands, debating whether to open it. Who had lost this? And how long had it been hidden here? Taking a deep breath, she flipped it open. Inside the wallet, time stood still. Faded black and white photos peeked out from one of the compartments. They were creased at the edges, the faces staring back at her from another era. Old currency, bills that hadn't been in circulation for decades, were folded neatly behind them. And then, the biggest revelation, an identification card. Nia squinted, bringing it closer under the diner's dim light. The name printed in elegant, old-fashioned script sent chills down her spine. Theodore Teddy Whitmore. The year, 1954. A cold shiver ran down Nia's arms. The 1950s? That was impossible. But the wallet was proof. It had been sitting under that floorboard for over 70 years. Her hands trembled slightly as she dug further. Inside she found something even stranger. A crumpled handwritten letter. The ink was faded, and the edges were delicate, as if it might crumble under her touch. The first words were smudged, but she could still make out parts of it. Lillian, I never meant to leave you. If anything happens to me, meet me at our place. Tell her The rest was illegible. A lump formed in Nia's throat. The words carried urgency, fear. Whoever Teddy was, he had been in trouble. Just then, Victor walked out of the kitchen, wiping his hands on a towel. He spotted her frozen at the booth. "You okay?" Nia hesitated before looking up, the wallet clutched in her hand. "Victor," she said slowly, "do you know the name Theodore Whitmore?" The moment the name left her lips, Victor stiffened. His usual easygoing demeanor vanished. He stared at her, then at the wallet, and his face turned pale. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. Nia gestured to the loose floorboard. "It was under there. It's old. Really old." Victor exhaled sharply and sank into the nearest chair. "Damn," he muttered, rubbing his jaw. He looked troubled. More than troubled. Like he had just seen a ghost. "What that?" Nia pressed, leaning forward. "Who was he?" Victor ran a hand over his head before meeting her gaze. Teddy Whitmore was a young activist back in the 1950s. He disappeared one night and was never seen again. Nia's stomach flipped. She looked down at the ID, at Teddy's young face frozen in time. Disappeared? Then why was his wallet hidden under the floor of this diner? Victor let out a slow breath, his fingers tapping against the table. "I haven't heard that name in years," he muttered. Hell, I didn't think anyone would ever bring it up again. Nia's curiosity burned stronger. Who was he, really? Victor leaned forward, lowering his voice as if the walls had ears. Teddy was more than just some guy who vanished. He was an activist, one of the loud ones. Always talking about change, standing up for folks when it wasn't safe to do that. Nia frowned. And then one night he just disappeared? Bonar. Victor hesitated, then nodded. That's what they said. Some folks thought he fled town, but others thought something bad happened to him. A chill ran down Nia's spine. Like what? Victor exhaled heavily. There were rumors. People said he got mixed up in something dangerous. Some believed he fell in love with the wrong woman, someone he wasn't supposed to be with. Others said he found out something about this town, something that made powerful people nervous. Nia glanced back at the wallet. The letter, the unfinished words. Tell her she knew she couldn't leave this alone. I need to know more, she whispered. Victor shook his head. Nia, some things are better left buried. But Nia wasn't listening. That night she took the wallet home, determined to find out the truth. That night Nia sat on her bed, the wallet and letter laid out in front of her. The dim light from her bedside lamp cast shadows across the old paper. She inhaled deeply, steadying her nerves before carefully unfolding the fragile letter. The name at the top was clear. Lillian. The words were rush, the handwriting uneven, as if written in distress. She traced the ink with her finger, reading each word slowly. If anything happens to me, just know I never meant to leave you. Meet me at our place. Tell her Her heart sank as the ink smudged beyond that point, leaving an agonizing blank space where the rest of the message should be. Tell her what? Who was her? Nia clenched her jaw. This wasn't just some lost wallet. It was a piece of a story that had never been finished. She grabbed her laptop and typed Theodore Whitmore disappearance into the search bar. Nothing. Just a brief mention in an old newspaper archive about a missing man from the 1950s. With no follow-up, no resolution. Frustration boiled in her chest. Someone had buried this story, deliberately. The lack of records only made it more suspicious. She bit her lip, staring at the unfinished letter. Lillian. That was the only lead she had. A thought struck her. What if she could find out who Lillian was? Determined, she pulled out her phone, scrolling through local historical archives. If the truth had been hidden this long, she was going to be the one to uncover it. The next morning, Nia walked into the Atlanta Historical Society, a grand but fading brick building nestled between newer developments. The air smelled of aged books and polished wood, the quiet hum of an old ceiling fan filling the silence. She approached the front desk where a frail but sharp-eyed woman sat flipping through a yellowed ledger. "Excuse me, ma'am," Nia said, clutching Teddy's wallet in her hands. "I was hoping to find some information on someone named Theodore Whitmore." The woman looked up, her glasses perched low on her nose. "You're looking for Geraldine Carter," she said, nodding toward a cozy reading area in the back. Nia turned and spotted Miss Geraldine Carter, a 90-year-old historian, sitting in a wooden armchair, a book resting on her lap. Her silver hair was neatly pinned up, her face lined with wisdom and time. Nia hesitated before approaching. "Miss Carter?" she asked, softly. The elderly woman looked up, her sharp brown eyes narrowing as she studied Nia. "Yes, dear?" Nia took a deep breath and showed her the wallet. "Do you know anything about a man named Theodore Whitmore?" The moment Geraldine saw the name, her breath hitched. Her wrinkled hands trembled slightly as she reached for the wallet. My, she whispered, running a finger over the faded leather. "I never thought I'd see this again." "You knew him?" Nia asked, her heart pounding. Geraldine nodded, eyes distant as if reliving a memory. "Oh yes, child. Everyone in this town knew Teddy." She sighed deeply, settling into her chair. "He was young, full of fire, always speaking about equality and justice. But what really set tongues wagging was his love affair." Nia leaned in. "With Lillian?" Geraldine's lips pressed together before she nodded. "Yes, Lillian Hartwell, a white woman." The weight of the words settled between them. Nia swallowed hard. She could only imagine how dangerous that relationship must have been back in the 1950s. "They loved each other fiercely," Geraldine continued, her voice wistful. "But the world wasn't ready for them. Lillian's father was a powerful man in this town, and he would have rather burned the world down than let his daughter be with a black man." Nia felt her fingers tighten around the wallet. "What happened to them?" Geraldine's gaze darkened. "One night, Teddy vanished. Just gone. No one saw him leave, no one heard a word, and not long after Lillian was whisked away, sent up north, never to return. Nia's stomach twisted. Did anyone ever find out what happened to Teddy? The old woman shook her head. Some said he ran, others whispered that something terrible happened to him, but no one dared to ask too many questions. Back then, you didn't ask questions if you valued your life. Silence stretched between them as Nia processed the weight of what she had just learned. A young activist, a forbidden love, a mysterious disappearance. Something inside her whispered that Teddy hadn't left by choice. I need to find out what happened to him, Nia said firmly. Geraldine studied her for a long moment before nodding. Then you best be careful, child. Some ghosts don't like to be disturbed. Geraldine's words lingered in Nia's mind as she sat in the dimly lit library of the Atlanta Historical Society later that afternoon. Dust motes floated through the golden light filtering in from tall, arched windows. The room was silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rustling of pages. Geraldine had mentioned rumors, whispers about Teddy's disappearance. But what if there had been an actual record, something tangible, something hidden away? Nia ran her fingers over the aged newspaper archives until she found the year 1954. She skimmed through brittle pages, her heart hammering in her chest. Then, suddenly, she froze. There it was, a small article buried in the back pages of a 1954 newspaper. The headline read, "Unidentified body found in Atlanta woods. No foul play suspected." Nia's stomach clenched as she scanned the text. A male body had been discovered just outside the city limits. No identification, no known next of kin. The authorities had ruled it an accidental death, citing exposure as the likely cause. But something about the way it was written didn't sit right with her. Unidentified? She whispered to herself. That didn't make sense. If Teddy had been missing, wouldn't someone have connected the dots? Was his death ignored on purpose? She pulled out her phone and took a picture of the article. She needed more. The next morning, Nia found herself standing in front of the old Atlanta Police Department archives, a weathered brick building tucked away from the main streets. The receptionist, an older woman with tight silver curls, barely glanced up as Nia made her request. "Missing persons reports from the 1950s?" the woman repeated, eyeing Nia suspiciously. "Why on earth would you need those?" "I'm researching an old case for a history project," Nia said quickly, forcing a polite smile. The woman sighed, muttering about young folks digging up the past, but eventually returned with a thick folder labeled 1954 Unsolved Cases. Nia's fingers trembled as she flipped through the brittle pages, scanning for Teddy's name, and then she found it. There, in faded ink, was a case file marked Theodore Whitmore Disappearance. She flipped the page and gasped. A grainy black and white photo stared back at her. The image was old and blurred, but the lifeless body in the woods bore an eerie resemblance to the young man from Teddy's ID. Nia swallowed hard. It was him. Her pulse quickened as she read through the report. The case had been dismissed as an accident, but why? Why had no one followed up? Something wasn't right. And the last known place Teddy had been seen? The very diner where she worked. Nia gripped the folder tighter. Someone had covered this up, and if she kept digging, she might not be the only one looking for answers. That evening, the diner felt different. The usual hum of conversation was absent, replaced by a heavy stillness that clung to the air. The bell above the door jingled, and Nia instinctively looked up from where she was refilling the napkin dispensers. An elderly white man had just walked in. He moved slowly, his frame lean but sturdy, his face weathered by time. His eyes, however, were sharp. Too sharp. He scanned the room, his gaze locking onto Nia. A strange unease crept up her spine. She tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the quiet conversation between two other waitresses at the counter. One of them, a younger girl named Tasha, had overheard Nia talking about the wallet earlier that day. "You really think that wallet's connected to something?" Tasha asked in a hushed tone. "I don't think," Nia murmured, keeping her voice low. "I know. The police report was a cover-up." The moment the words left her mouth, the old man coughed loudly, drawing both their attention. "Young lady," his voice was raspy but firm. "Some stories are better left buried." The diner fell silent. Nia's stomach tightened as she turned fully to face him. "Excuse me?" He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her. "You're asking questions that should have stayed unanswered." His fingers drummed against the counter. "You don't want to get tangled in things bigger than you." Victor, who had been watching from the kitchen window, stepped out from the back, wiping his hands on his apron. "Everything okay here?" he asked, his tone neutral but wary. The old man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he sighed, almost as if resigned to something. Then, with an unsettling smirk, he muttered, "Be careful, girl. The past has a way of dragging people down with it." With that, he turned and walked out of the diner, leaving a cold chill in his wake. Tasha let out a shaky breath. "What the hell was that?" Nia stared at the door, her pulse hammering. That wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. Later that night, when the diner had emptied and the street outside had quieted, Nia sat at one of the booths, staring at her notes. She couldn't let this go. If someone wanted to keep Teddy's story hidden, then she needed to find out why. She flipped through the old documents she had copied from the police archives earlier. That's when she noticed something she had overlooked before, a diner employee roster from 1954. Her finger traced the list of names, and then she stopped. Henry Whitmore. Her breath caught in her throat. Teddy's brother. She quickly grabbed her phone and searched the name. A few minutes later, her screen flashed with an address. A small house just outside the city. He was still alive. Nia clenched her fists. If anyone had answers, it was Henry, and she was going to find him. The next morning, Nia sat in her car outside a small, run-down house on the outskirts of town. The white paint peeled from the wooden panels, and a rusted old truck sat motionless in the driveway. A worn-out porch swing creaked in the light breeze. She clutched the wallet in her hands, her heartbeat quickening. If Henry Whitmore was still alive, he was the last connection to Teddy, the last person who might finally give her the truth. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. Seconds passed before the door creaked open, revealing an elderly black man with deep-set eyes and a weary face. He studied her cautiously, his grip tightening on the edge of the doorframe. "Who are you?" His voice was rough, aged by time and loss. "My name's Nia," she said, steadying herself. "I work at Manny's Diner." She hesitated before holding up the wallet. "I found this." Henry's breath hitched, his eyes widened, and for a moment he just stared. Then, as if the years caught up to him all at once, he let out a shuddering breath and reached for the doorpost to steady himself. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. Nia swallowed hard. "It was hidden under a floorboard at the diner." Henry shook his head slowly, his gaze distant. "All these years, I thought it was gone." His voice cracked with something between relief and sorrow. He stepped back, motioning for her to enter. Inside, the house smelled of old wood and faded memories. Shelves lined with dusty picture frames told stories of a past long buried. Henry lowered himself into a worn-out armchair, staring at the wallet in Nia's hands. She sat across from him, waiting, watching the way his fingers twitched like they weren't sure whether to reach for it or not. Finally he spoke. "Teddy, my little brother. He was murdered." Nia's stomach clenched. She had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold chill through her. Henry exhaled sharply. It wasn't an accident. They killed him and made it disappear, like he never existed. "Who?" Nia pressed. Henry's jaw tightened. "Lillian's father, Henry Hartwell, the most powerful man in town back then." Nia's breath caught in her throat. "Lillian's father?" Henry nodded slowly. "He found out about them, about how much they loved each other. And he wouldn't stand for it." He clenched his fists. So he had Teddy taken care of. The weight of the revelation settled like a stone in Nia's chest. "But the police, they covered it up." Henry's voice was sharp, bitter. "Hartwell owned them. He made sure there was no case, no investigation, just a body left in the woods with no name." Nia's fingers curled around the edge of the table. It made sense now. The missing records, the erased history. Teddy hadn't just disappeared. He had been silenced. Henry rubbed his temples, exhaustion washing over him. Lillian? She never forgave herself. She tried to fight it, tried to run, but he sent her away, forced her to leave town. Nia hesitated. "What happened to her?" Henry's eyes softened. "She lived long enough to have a daughter." Nia's pulse quickened. "A daughter?" Henry nodded, his expression unreadable. "She left behind a girl who never knew the truth about her parents." Nia's mind raced. If Lillian had a daughter, that meant there was still a piece of Teddy left in the world. A piece of this story that wasn't lost after all. She met Henry's gaze, determination tightening her resolve. "I need to find her." Henry exhaled, studying her carefully. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Then you better be ready, because this town doesn't like when the past gets dug up. Nia sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her, surrounded by scattered notes and old newspaper clippings. She had spent hours piecing together Lillian's family history, following every clue Henry had given her. But nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to uncover. Her fingers trembled as she clicked on a digitized census record from the 1970s. She traced the names carefully, eyes scanning down the page. Then, her breath hitched. Lillian Hartwell had a daughter. The name stared back at her like a revelation. Eleanor Simmons. Nia's mind raced. That name was familiar. She had grown up hearing it. Because Eleanor Simmons was her grandmother. Her throat went dry as she leaned back in her chair, staring at the screen in disbelief. If Eleanor was Lillian's daughter, then that meant she slowly reached for the old letter Teddy had written all those years ago, her fingers running over the faded ink. "Tell her I—" The unfinished words echoed in her mind. He had been trying to reach his own family. She wasn't just investigating someone else's story. She was a part of it. Nia's pulse pounded in her ears as the truth settled over her like a heavy weight. Teddy Whitmore was her great-grandfather. The realization left her breathless. All this time, she had unknowingly been walking through the same streets where Teddy had once lived, working in the very diner where his story had been buried. The past wasn't just something distant. It was woven into her own history. She covered her mouth with her hand, emotions rushing through her in waves. The letter wasn't just a love note. It was a message meant for her family. A truth lost to time that had finally, after decades, made its way home. Tears stung her eyes, but beneath the shock and grief, there was something else. A burning need to set things right. Teddy's story deserved to be told. His name needed to be remembered. And Nia knew now, more than ever, that she was the one who had to do it. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed Henry's number. When he answered, she barely managed to whisper, "Henry, I think I found the truth." Silence hung for a long moment before the old man spoke. "Tell me, child." Nia inhaled deeply. "I'm Teddy's great-granddaughter." She could hear the sharp intake of breath on the other end. Then, in a voice thick with emotion, Henry whispered, "Well, I'll be damned." The weight of history pressed down on her, but Nia knew what she had to do next. It was time to tell the world the truth about Theodore Whitmore. Nia sat at her desk, staring at her computer screen. The cursor blinked, waiting for her next keystroke. She took a deep breath and continued typing, her fingers steady with purpose. Theodore Whitmore's story would not be forgotten. The next morning, her article hit the internet like wildfire. The headline read, "Buried Truths, the Unsolved Murder of Theodore Whitmore." She had laid it all out. The forbidden love, the conspiracy, the cover-up. She named names, presented evidence, and demanded justice. Social media exploded. People shared the article, outraged at how history had tried to erase a man who had done nothing but love someone society told him he couldn't. A week later, the town of Atlanta held a public memorial service for Theodore Whitmore. Nia stood in the crowd as city officials unveiled a plaque in his honor. His name was finally where it belonged, etched into history. Henry Whitmore stood beside her, his wrinkled hands clutching a copy of the article, tears streaming down his face. In the back of the gathering, a familiar figure lingered, the mysterious, elderly man from the diner. Before Nia could approach him, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the city streets. A single note was left on the memorial's stone base. The past never truly stays buried, does it? Nia picked up the note, staring at the words, her heart pounding. Who was he? And how did he know so much? She didn't have the answer, maybe she never would, but one thing was clear, Teddy's story had found its way home. With trembling hands, she pulled the old wallet from her coat pocket. She stepped forward, kneeling at the base of the memorial. Carefully, she placed the wallet beside the plaque, her fingers lingering over the worn leather. "You're home now," she whispered. She stood, taking a deep breath, and walked away. The wind carried the rustling of leaves around her, and for a brief moment she could almost swear she heard a voice from the past. Soft, grateful. As she disappeared into the crowd, the camera lingered on the plaque, where Theodore Whitmore's name gleamed under the sunlight. Below it, his old ID card lay still, untouched by time. 1954. Never forgotten. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more stories that stay with you long after they're told.